The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the parking lot of the Coastal Marine Salvage Yard into a sea of mud and broken dreams. Elena Vasquez stood beneath a torn awning, her secondhand coat soaked through to the bone, watching her 2 children huddle together on a wooden crate. Sofia, 7 years old, had her arms wrapped around her younger brother Miguel, who was only 4. Their breath came out in small white clouds, and Sofia's lips had begun to turn blue. Elena had driven them here in a rusted Ford pickup that belonged to her late husband's memory and little else. The truck burned oil and the heater had stopped working 3 states ago, somewhere in the long dark stretch between the life she'd lost and whatever waited for her now. She had $43 in her pocket, a quarter tank of gas, and nowhere to sleep tonight. The motel in town wanted $60, and the woman behind the counter had looked at Elena's children with something between pity and suspicion, before shaking her head. The salvage yard had been a last resort. Elena had heard that Old Man Patterson sometimes let people camp on the property if they were willing to work in the morning, sorting through the endless piles of maritime debris that washed up from insurance claims and abandoned vessels. She needed one night, just one night out of the rain, and then she would figure out something else. She'd been figuring out something else for 8 months now, ever since the bank took the house, ever since her mother-in-law had made it clear that Elena and her half-Mexican children were not welcome in the Vasquez family home, ever since the world had shown her exactly how little protection a wedding ring provided when the man who gave it was 6 feet underground. "Mama," Sofia whispered, her voice small and tired, "is this where we're going to live?" Elena felt something crack inside her chest. She knelt down in the mud, ruining the only decent pair of pants she had left, and pulled both children close. Miguel pressed his face into her neck, and she could feel how cold his skin was, how his small body trembled. "No, baby," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This is just a stop. We're going to find somewhere warm, I promise." It was a lie, and Sofia was old enough to know it. Her daughter looked at her with those dark, serious eyes that had seen too much in 7 years. Eyes that had watched her father waste away in a hospital bed, that had watched strangers carry furniture out of their home, that had watched her grandmother slam a door in their faces. But Sofia nodded anyway, because that was what children did when they loved their mothers. They believed impossible things. The office door of the salvage yard opened, and a man stepped out. He was perhaps 70, with a weathered face and hands that had spent a lifetime pulling things from the sea. He wore a yellow rain slicker and carried a thermos, and when he saw Elena and the children, something shifted in his expression. "You the one who called about work?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Elena Vasquez. I can sort, clean, inventory, whatever you need. She hesitated, her pride catching in her throat. "I just need somewhere for my kids to sleep tonight. Out of the rain." Patterson studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at the children, at Sofia's protective grip on her brother, at Miguel's runny nose and chattering teeth. He let out a long breath. "I've got a storage building out back," he said. "It's dry, got a space heater, not much, but it's something." He held up a hand before Elena could thank him. "But I need to know something first. You running from the law? Got someone looking for you?" "No, sir, I'm just running out of options." He nodded slowly, as if this was an answer he understood. "Aren't we all?" The storage building was a corrugated metal structure filled with salvaged ship parts, but Patterson had cleared a corner and set up a few cots with military blankets. There was a camp stove, a small refrigerator, and a space heater that glowed orange and hummed with warmth. To Elena, who had spent the last 3 nights sleeping in the truck, it looked like a palace. She got the children settled, fed them crackers and peanut butter from their dwindling supplies, and sat with them until they fell asleep. Miguel went quickly, exhausted beyond his years, but Sofia fought to keep her eyes open. "Mama," she said quietly, "are we going to be okay?" Elena brushed the hair back from her daughter's forehead. The gesture reminded her of her own mother, long dead, and of all the nights she had been the one asking that question. "We're going to be better than okay," she said. "We're going to find our place in this world. I promise you that." Sofia's eyes finally closed, and Elena sat there in the dim light, listening to the rain and wondering how many more promises she could make before she broke. The next morning dawned grey and cold, but the rain had stopped. Elena woke before the children and found Patterson already in the yard, moving through the rows of a salvage with a clipboard. He handed her a cup of coffee without a word, and she took it with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion. "Got an auction today," he said, nodding toward a section of the yard she hadn't seen the night before. "County's clearing out some abandoned vessels from the naval shipyard. Mostly junk, but sometimes there's gold in the garbage." He paused. "You ever work with boats?" "My husband was a fisherman," Elena said. "Before he got sick, I know my way around an engine." Patterson considered this. "There's a piece coming up today. Old research submarine. Decommissioned maybe 30 years ago. Navy sold it to a private buyer back in the 80s, and it's been sitting in impound ever since. Owner died, no heirs came forward, so now the county wants it gone." He shook his head. "Thing's a rust bucket, probably full of asbestos, but the scrap metal alone might be worth something." "How much are they asking?" "Minimum bid is $500. Nobody in their right mind would want it, but you never know with auctions." Eleanor thought about the $43 in her pocket, about the children sleeping on borrowed cots, about the endless road that stretched before her with no destination in sight. And then she thought about something her husband had told her once, in those last weeks when the cancer had made him philosophical. "Elena, the world isn't fair, but sometimes it leaves doors open for people who are desperate enough to walk through them." She had no idea what she would do with a submarine. She couldn't eat it, couldn't live in it, couldn't drive it anywhere, but something in her chest, some stubborn, irrational spark that had kept her moving through 8 months of hell, told her to pay attention. The auction began at noon. Eleanor stood at the back of the small crowd, Sofia and Miguel beside her, watching as lot after lot went up for bid. Boat motors, anchor chains, a fishing trawler that was more hull than hull. The submarine came up near the end, and just as Patterson had predicted, the crowd's interest evaporated. "Lot 47, the auctioneer announced. 1953 research submarine, designation unclear. Sold as is with no warranty or guarantee of seaworthiness. All contents included. Minimum bid $500. Silence. The auctioneer looked around the yard, his enthusiasm visibly waning. "Anyone? $500 for a genuine Cold War-era submarine. Think of the history." More silence. Someone in the crowd coughed. "$400 then." "Do I hear 400? Nothing. Eleanor's hand went to her pocket, to the crumpled bills that represented everything she had left. $43, not even close. But then Patterson appeared at her elbow, and he pressed something into her palm. $800 bills, crisp and worn. "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said quietly. "You can work it off, but something tells me you should bid on that thing." She looked at him, this stranger who had no reason to help her, and saw something in his eyes that she couldn't quite name. Kindness, maybe, or recognition. The look of someone who had once been where she was standing. $300, the auctioneer said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Come on, people, it's a submarine. $300. Eleanor raised her hand. $800. The auctioneer blinked. The crowd turned to look at her, a soaking wet woman in a ruined coat, with 2 small children clinging to her legs. She could see what they were thinking. She could feel their judgment, like a physical weight. $800, the auctioneer said slowly. "Do I hear $850? Anyone? $850? The silence stretched. Eleanor held her breath. "Sold," the auctioneer said finally, "for $800 to the lady in the back." And just like that, Elena Vasquez became the owner of an abandoned submarine. The submarine sat in a far corner of the salvage yard, half hidden by a tarp that had rotted through in a dozen places. Up close, it was even more decrepit than Elena had imagined, the hull streaked with rust, the conning tower listing to one side, the entire structure giving off an aura of profound neglect. It was roughly 60 feet long, small as submarines went, with faded markings on the side that might once have read USS something, but the letters had long since been eaten by time and salt. "Mama," Miguel said, his eyes wide, "is that ours?" "It is, baby. Can we go inside?" Eleanor looked at Patterson, who had followed them across the yard. He shrugged. "Hatch should still work. Just be careful. No telling what's grown in there over the years." The main hatch was located on top of the conning tower, accessible by a ladder welded to the hull. Elena climbed up first, her muscles protesting, and tested the wheel. It resisted for a long moment, decades of corrosion fighting against her, and then gave way with a screech of metal. She lifted the hatch and looked down into darkness. The smell that wafted up was surprisingly mild. Old metal, stale air, and something faintly chemical. She descended the ladder slowly, feeling for each rung until her feet touched the floor of the control room. Pale light filtered down from the open hatch, revealing shapes in the darkness. Instrument panels, periscope housings, a navigation table covered in charts that had yellowed with age. "It's okay," she called up. "You can come down." Patterson lowered the children, one by one, and Elena caught them, setting them gently on the floor. Sofia immediately began exploring, her fear giving way to curiosity, while Miguel stayed close to Elena's side, his hand gripping her coat. The interior of the submarine was a time capsule. Everything had been left exactly as it was the day the vessel was decommissioned, or perhaps the day its mysterious private owner had abandoned it. There were coffee mugs in the galley, still bearing the faded rings of decades-old beverages. There were books in the small crew quarters, their pages swollen with humidity. There were papers scattered across the navigation table, covered in handwritten notes that Elena couldn't quite decipher. "What is all this?" she asked Patterson. He was examining one of the instrument panels, his expression unreadable. "Don't know. Looks like someone was using this thing for research, even after the Navy sold it. Private expeditions, maybe? Oceanography? Treasure hunting?" He paused. "Or something else?" They spent the next several hours exploring the submarine, opening compartments that hadn't been touched in years, cataloguing what they found. Most of it was worthless. Rusted equipment, rotted fabric, documents too damaged to read. But there was something strange about the layout of the vessel, something that nagged at Elena's attention without her being able to name it. It was Sofia who figured it out. "Mama," she said, her voice echoing from the aft section of the submarine, "there's a door here that doesn't go anywhere." Elena made her way through the narrow corridor, past the engine room and the battery compartments, to where her daughter stood. Sofia was pointing at a section of the wall that looked identical to every other section. Riveted metal panels, covered in the same layer of grime and neglect. But when Elena looked closer, she could see what her daughter had noticed. A faint rectangular outline, almost invisible, that suggested a seam where there shouldn't be one. "Patterson!" she called. The old man appeared a few minutes later, and his eyes narrowed when he saw what Elena was pointing at. "False panel," he said. "Seen them before on smuggling vessels. Hidden compartments." He ran his hand along the edges, searching for a release mechanism. "Question is, what's behind it?" It took them another hour to find the latch, a small lever hidden inside one of the overhead pipes, designed to look like part of the machinery. When Eleanor pulled it, there was a soft click, and the panel swung inward, revealing a space roughly the size of a closet. Inside, stacked from floor to ceiling, were metal containers. Dozens of them. Each one was sealed with a waterproof lock, and each one was stamped with the same symbol, a stylized wave inside a circle. "What is this?" Eleanor whispered. Patterson was silent. His face had gone pale. "Open one," Sofia said. Elena reached for the nearest container, her hands trembling. The lock was rusted but not impossible, and after a few minutes of work she managed to pry it open. She lifted the lid. Inside, arranged in neat rows, were gold bars. Real gold, heavy and gleaming, untouched by time. Beneath them were papers, documents, photographs, maps, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them perfectly preserved, were journals. Dozens of journals, filled with cramped handwriting and detailed sketches. Eleanor picked up one of the journals and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, and the date at the top made her breath catch, March 15th, 1962. "My name is Adelaide Thornton," the entry began. "I'm recording this account so that the truth may survive, even if I do not. What we discovered in the Pacific was not meant to be found, not by us and certainly not by my father and his partners, but we found it nonetheless, and now they will do anything to ensure it remains buried. If you are reading this, then I'm likely dead, and this vessel has passed into other hands." I pray that those hands are honest, because what lies in this compartment represents not just a fortune, but evidence of a crime that powerful men will kill to keep hidden. Elena looked up from the journal, her heart pounding. Through the open hatch above, she could see the grey sky, the mundane world of the salvage yard, her children's faces watching her with curiosity and trust. And in her hands, she held something that felt like a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Patterson," she said slowly, "what exactly did I buy?" The days that followed were a blur of discovery and growing dread. Elena worked through Adelaide Thornton's journals late into each night, after the children were asleep, piecing together a story that seemed too terrible to be true. Adelaide had been a marine biologist in the early 1960s, the daughter of shipping magnate Warren Thornton. She had used her father's money to fund a series of oceanographic expeditions, ostensibly to study deep-sea ecosystems, but her real purpose had been something else entirely. She was searching for proof of her father's crimes. The Thornton family had made its fortune in shipping, but the journals revealed that their wealth had a darker origin. During World War II, Warren Thornton and his partners had been contracted to transport war supplies across the Pacific. What the government didn't know was that they were also transporting something else: gold. Not just any gold, but looted treasure from occupied territories, artwork, jewellery, religious artifacts, and raw bullion stolen from families who had been murdered or displaced by the war. The gold had never reached its intended destination. Instead, the Thorntons and their partners had diverted it to a series of secret locations, using their legitimate shipping routes as cover. They had built fortunes on blood money, and when the war ended, they had buried the truth, along with the gold. Adelaide had suspected for years. She had grown up surrounded by wealth that felt somehow tainted, and as she got older, she had begun to investigate. The Submarine had been her tool, a vessel she had purchased under a false name, outfitted for deep-sea exploration, used to retrace her father's wartime roots. And on one of those expeditions, she had found it, a sunken ship in the Pacific, its hold still filled with looted treasure, its manifest proving beyond doubt what the Thorntons had done. But Adelaide had never been able to reveal the truth. According to her journals, her father had discovered her investigation. She had gone into hiding, using the submarine as her refuge, documenting everything she had found. The gold bars in the compartment were samples she had retrieved from the sunken ship, evidence that could not be denied. The documents were shipping manifests, financial records, personal correspondence, and the photographs were the most damning of all. Images of the original theft, taken by someone who had been there, showing exactly who was involved. The last entry in the journals was dated November 1963. "They have found me," Adelaide had written. "I am leaving the submarine in a place where it may not be discovered for many years. I have made arrangements for it to pass through legitimate channels, so that when it is finally found, there will be no way to trace it back to me, or to suppress what it contains. The Thorntons believe they have won. They believe they can buy or destroy anything that threatens their legacy. But the truth is patient. It waits. And someday, someone will find this vessel and understand what it means. I only pray that they have the courage to do what I could not." Adelaide Thornton had vanished in November 1963. Officially, she had drowned in a boating accident. Her body was never found. Elena sat in the storage building. The journals spread around her, and felt the weight of 60 years of injustice pressing down on her shoulders. She had bought a submarine for $800, hoping for scrap metal. Instead, she had inherited a dead woman's crusade. And the Thorntons were still out there. She had looked them up on Patterson's ancient computer, and what she found had made her blood run cold. The Thornton family was now one of the wealthiest dynasties on the East Coast. Warren Thornton had died in 1985, but his legacy lived on through his grandchildren. Harrison Thornton, who ran a hedge fund with billions under management, Caroline Thornton Webb, who sat on the boards of half a dozen major corporations, and most troubling of all, Judge Margaret Thornton, who had recently been nominated for a seat on the Federal Appeals Court. These were people with power, real power, the kind of power that could make problems disappear, that could rewrite history, that could crush a homeless single mother without breaking a sweat. Eleanor thought about her children. sleeping soundly on their borrowed cots. She thought about the gold bars worth millions that were sitting in a submarine 50 feet away. She thought about Adelaide Thornton, dead for 60 years, whose final hope had been that someone would find her evidence and have the courage to act. And she thought about herself, exhausted, desperate, pushed to the very edge of what a human being could endure. She had spent 8 months fighting just to survive. Now she was being asked to fight for something bigger, something that might destroy her entirely. But as she sat there in the darkness, she realized that she had already made her choice, not because she was brave, but because she had nothing left to lose. The world had taken everything from her: her husband, her home, her dignity, her future. It had shown her exactly how little protection the weak had against the strong. And now, by pure accident, she had been handed a weapon. The Thorntons had built their empire on stolen gold and buried secrets. Elena was going to tear it down. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Elena had spent those weeks quietly, working in the salvage yard during the day, studying the journals at night, making copies of every document and photograph she could. Patterson had asked no questions, but she could feel his concern, his unspoken worry about what she was planning. The letter was addressed to her by name, her real name, which she had not given to anyone in this town except Patterson. It was written on cream-coloured stationery, the kind that cost more per sheet than Elena spent on food in a week. The return address was a law firm in Boston, Whitmore, Chen and Associates. Dear Ms. Vasquez, the letter read, it has come to our attention that you have recently acquired a vessel formerly belonging to a member of the Thornton family. Our clients are prepared to make a generous offer for the return of this vessel and any contents therein. We understand that your current circumstances may make such an offer attractive. A representative will be in contact to discuss terms. We trust that you will give this matter your full consideration and that you understand the importance of discretion in all matters relating to the Thornton family. There was no signature, no specific offer, just a threat wrapped in silk. Elena's hands were shaking as she set the letter down. They knew. Somehow impossibly, they knew. Someone had been watching the auction. Someone had traced the submarine's history. Someone had connected the dots, and now they were coming for her. "Mama!" Sofia's voice from the doorway of the storage building. "Who sent you that letter?" Elena forced herself to smile. "Nobody important, baby. Just some paperwork." But Sofia was watching her mother's face, reading the fear there with the uncanny perception that children sometimes have. "Is someone trying to hurt us?" Elena pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the warmth of her small body. "No one is going to hurt us," she said. "I won't let them." It was another promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The representative arrived 2 days later. He drove a black Mercedes that looked absurdly out of place in the salvage yard, and he wore a suit that probably cost more than Elena's truck was worth. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of polished confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and the assumption that every door would open for him. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, extending his hand, "my name is David Mercer. I represent the Thornton family's interests." Elena did not shake his hand. "I read your letter." "Then you understand that we're prepared to be very generous. The submarine has sentimental value to the family. It belonged to a deceased relative. We'd like to see it returned to its proper place." "Adelaide Thornton?" Something flickered in Mercer's eyes. "I'm sorry?" "The deceased relative. Her name was Adelaide Thornton. She was Warren Thornton's daughter. She disappeared in 1963. Elena kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Right around the time she discovered what her father had done during the war. The mask of politeness on Mercer's face did not slip, but Elena could see the calculation behind it, the rapid reassessment of who he was dealing with. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm not sure what you think you know. I know everything. I've read Adelaide's journals. I've seen the documents, the photographs, the shipping manifests. I've seen the gold." Silence. The wind picked up, rattling the corrugated metal walls of the storage building, and somewhere in the distance, Elena could hear her children laughing. "Let me be direct with you," Mercer said finally. His voice had lost its veneer of friendliness. "The Thornton family has significant resources. Legal resources, financial resources, and other resources that I don't need to specify. Whatever you think you've found, you're not equipped to do anything with it. You're a homeless woman with 2 children and no money. We're offering you a way out. How much? $500,000. Cash. Today. You sign over the submarine and everything in it. You sign a non-disclosure agreement and you walk away. You never speak of this again. To anyone. Ever. In return, you get to start over. New life, new future, no more sleeping in salvage yards. Elena thought about that number. $500,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined having. It would solve every problem she had. The housing, the food, the education for her children, the medical bills that were still piling up from her husband's treatment. It would give her everything she'd been praying for, and it would mean that Adelaide Thornton had died for nothing, that the stolen gold would remain hidden, that the Thorntons would go on living their gilded lives, untouched by justice, secure in the knowledge that their crimes were buried forever. No, Elena said. Mercer blinked. Excuse me? I said no, I'm not selling. Ms. Vasquez, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. You're scared. The Thorntons are scared. Adelaide's evidence is real, and if it gets out, your clients lose everything. Their money, their reputation, their precious judge's nomination. So you came here to buy my silence, because that's what your family has always done. You buy people, you bury things. Elena stepped closer to him, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his eyes. But you can't buy me. I don't have anything left for you to threaten. I've already lost everything, and that makes me very, very dangerous. Mercer's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. He stared at her for a long moment, and then turned and walked back to his car without another word. Elena watched him go, feeling the adrenaline drain out of her body, leaving her weak and shaking. She had just declared war on one of the most powerful families in the country. She had no idea how she was going to win. The attacks began subtly. First, there were phone calls, silent ones at all hours of the night, the caller breathing heavily before hanging up. Then there were the strangers who started appearing at the salvage yard, men who claimed to be inspectors or surveyors, asking questions about Elena, about the submarine, about where she was keeping certain items. Patterson ran them off with a shotgun and a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush, but they kept coming. Then the county called. There had been a complaint, they said. The submarine was a hazard. It needed to be removed immediately, or Elena would face fines she couldn't possibly pay. Patterson spent 3 days on the phone, arguing with bureaucrats, until a lawyer friend of his found a technicality that bought them time. But the message was clear. The Thorntons were tightening the noose. Elena worked faster. She had reached out to journalists, to historians, to attorneys who specialised in restitution cases. Most of them didn't return her calls. The few who did were sceptical, cautious, unwilling to take on a case that put them in direct conflict with a family as powerful as the Thorntons. One lawyer told her, off the record, that she was lucky the family hadn't already destroyed her. They're being patient, he said. They're hoping you'll crack. Give it time. But time was exactly what Elena didn't have. The children were struggling. Sofia had stopped eating properly, and Miguel cried every night, asking when they could go home. The stress was wearing Elena down, stealing her sleep, making her jump at shadows. She could feel herself fraying at the edges, and she knew that if she didn't act soon, she would break. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One morning, a woman appeared at the salvage yard, elegant, grey-haired, perhaps 70 years old. She drove a modest sedan and wore clothes that were expensive, but understated, and she walked with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating dangerous waters. My name is Ruth Kaplan, she said. I believe we have something to discuss. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She had learned to be suspicious of everyone, to assume that anyone who approached her was working for the Thorntons. But something about Ruth's demeanour made her hesitate. There was a weariness in the older woman's eyes, a depth of sorrow that seemed too genuine to be manufactured. What do you want? Eleanor asked. Justice, Ruth said. The same thing you want. The same thing my family has been waiting for since 1943. They sat in the storage building, surrounded by the evidence Elena had gathered, and Ruth told her story. Her grandparents had been merchants in the Philippines before the war. They had been wealthy, respected members of their community, and when the occupation came, they had hidden their gold, generations of accumulated wealth, hoping to survive long enough to reclaim it. They hadn't survived. The gold had been taken, along with everything else, and Ruth's grandparents had died in a camp, their names lost to history. Ruth had spent her entire adult life trying to trace what had happened to her family's wealth, following paper trails and rumours, hitting dead end after dead end, until 6 months ago, when a dying man had given her a name, Warren Thornton. "I've known about Adelaide for years," Ruth said. "I knew she had evidence, but I could never find it. I'd almost given up." She looked around the storage building, at the journals and documents and photographs that Elena had spread across every surface. "And then I heard about you, the woman who bought a submarine at auction and refused to sell it to the Thorntons." She smiled, and there was something fierce in it, something unbroken. "I knew I had to find you." "They'll destroy us both," Elena said. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they've finally made an enemy they can't buy or bury. I have resources, Ms. Vasquez. I have connections. I have decades of research that corroborates everything in Adelaide's journals. And most importantly, I have absolutely nothing to lose." Ruth reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "The Thorntons have been hiding from the truth for 60 years. I think it's time we brought it into the light." Together, they built a case. Ruth's connections opened doors that had been closed to Elena. Historians who specialised in wartime asset recovery, attorneys who worked on behalf of looted arts claimants, investigative journalists who were willing to take on powerful targets if the story was big enough. The evidence from the submarine was authenticated, cross-referenced with wartime records, matched against Ruth's own research. The case was airtight, and word began to spread. Articles appeared in small publications, then larger ones. The story of the submarine, the hidden gold, and Adelaide Thornton's 60-year-old crusade began to capture public attention. The Thorntons responded with lawyers, with threats, with op-eds questioning the credibility of the accusers. But the evidence was too strong, the paper trail too clear. For the first time in their lives, the family was on the defensive. The summons came on a Tuesday morning. Elena had been expecting it. The Thorntons had finally decided to stop playing games and fight in the open. A civil lawsuit claiming that the submarine and its contents were stolen property, that Elena had no legal right to any of it, that she should be required to return everything immediately and pay damages for defamation. It was a power play, a show of force, and Elena knew that the real battle would not be won in court, but in the meeting that would precede it. The Thornton family estate was located 2 hours outside the city, set on 100 acres of carefully manicured grounds. The main house was Georgian revival, all red brick and white columns, the kind of architecture designed to project wealth and permanence and unassailable legitimacy. Elena drove through the gates with Ruth beside her, both of them carrying briefcases full of documents, both of them wearing the best clothes they could afford. Sofia and Miguel were back at the salvage yard, being watched by Patterson. Elena had considered bringing them, had thought about the symbolism of showing the Thorntons exactly what they were trying to destroy, but in the end she couldn't do it. Some battles weren't meant for children. They were met at the door by a butler who led them through a marble foyer, past walls hung with original artwork, into a study lined with leather-bound books that had probably never been read. 3 people were waiting for them there. Harrison Thornton, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from decades of never being told no. Caroline Thornton Webb, elegant and cold, her expression suggesting that Eleanor was something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her shoe. And Judge Margaret Thornton, whose judicial robes were not in evidence but whose authority was palpable nonetheless. No lawyers, no witnesses, just the family and the women who were trying to destroy them. "Ms. Vasquez," Harrison said, gesturing to a pair of chairs that had been positioned across from a massive desk. "And Ms. Kaplan, please sit." Elena sat. Ruth did the same. "I'll be direct," Harrison continued. "This lawsuit is a formality. We both know that you don't have the resources to fight us in court for as long as it takes. What I'm offering you now is a final opportunity to end this quietly, before anyone else gets hurt." "Before we get hurt, you mean?" Elena said. Harrison smiled. It did not reach his eyes. I mean exactly what I said. You've stirred up a great deal of attention with your little crusade, Ms. Vasquez. Some of that attention is coming from people who don't share our family's restraint. If this matter isn't resolved soon, I can't guarantee your safety. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. The world is a dangerous place, especially for a woman in your position. A single mother, no fixed address, 2 young children. He let the words hang in the air. Terrible things can happen. Elena felt her hands clench on the arms of her chair. She thought about Sofia and Miguel, about their faces, about the sound of their laughter. She thought about what it would mean to lose them, to have them taken from her by violence, or by the courts that the Thorntons controlled. The fear was a living thing inside her, clawing at her chest, begging her to surrender. But then she thought about Adelaide Thornton, who had died alone and afraid, whose evidence had waited 60 years for someone to find it. She thought about Ruth's grandparents, whose names had been erased from history, whose gold had built the empire that now threatened to crush her. She thought about all the people whose lives had been destroyed so that this family could have leather-bound books they never read, and artwork they never looked at, and power they never questioned. No, she said. Caroline leaned forward. I don't think you understand your position. I understand it perfectly. Elena opened her briefcase and began placing documents on the desk. You want me to be afraid. You want me to think about my children and decide that their safety is more important than justice. And you're right, it is, but you made a mistake when you threatened me. She placed the final document on the desk, a notarized affidavit signed by her, by Ruth, and by a dozen witnesses. That's a copy of everything we have. The journals, the photographs, the shipping manifests, the gold authentication reports. 27 copies have been distributed to journalists, historians, attorneys, and family members of victims in 6 different countries. If anything happens to me, to my children, to Ruth, or to anyone connected to this case, all of it gets released simultaneously. Not just the evidence of your grandfather's crimes, but evidence of your attempts to cover it up. The harassment, the threats, the shell companies you've been using to buy silence. Elena met Harrison's eyes. You're right that I don't have the resources to fight you in court, but I don't need to win. I just need to make sure you can't win either. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena watched the Thorntons process what she had told them, watched their expressions cycle through disbelief, anger, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like respect. It was Judge Margaret who spoke first. You've put us in an impossible position. No, your grandfather did that 60 years ago. I'm just refusing to let you pretend otherwise. And what exactly do you want? Elena looked at Ruth, who nodded slightly. We want justice, Elena said. Full public disclosure of Warren Thornton's crimes. A formal apology from the family. Restitution to the families of the victims, not just the gold, but damages, funded by a trust that your family will establish and maintain in perpetuity. And we want Adelaide's story told. We want everyone to know what she sacrificed trying to expose the truth. That would destroy us, Caroline said. No, it would change you. Elena stood gathering her documents. You've spent 60 years building a life on a foundation of lies. This is your chance to build something real, something honest, something your children and grandchildren can actually be proud of. She paused at the door. Or you can keep fighting. And I promise you, the only thing that will destroy is your family's chance at redemption. She left them sitting in their study, surrounded by their wealth and their secrets, and the weight of 60 years of deferred justice. The public disclosure happened 3 months later. The Thorntons had fought every step of the way, had tried every legal maneuver their army of attorneys could devise, but the evidence was too strong, and the public pressure too intense. In the end, they had agreed to Elena's terms, not out of conscience, but out of survival instinct. The alternative was complete annihilation. The announcement was made at a press conference that was carried live by every major news network. Harrison Thornton stood at a podium, his face grey with strain, and read a statement acknowledging his grandfather's crimes. Behind him, on a large screen, photographs from Adelaide's collection were displayed, images of the original theft, of the victims, of the shipping routes that had been used to launder stolen gold. Ruth was there, representing the families who had waited decades for this moment. She spoke quietly about her grandparents, about their names and their faces, and the life they had been denied. She did not cry, but Elena could see the tremor in her hands, the effort it took to maintain her composure. And when it was over, when the cameras had been turned off, and the reporters had filed their stories, Elena stood alone on the steps of the building and watched the sun set over a city that had finally heard the truth. 1 year later, Elena stood in the kitchen of her new home, watching Sofia and Miguel play in the backyard. The house was small but solid, purchased with her share of the restitution fund, located in a neighbourhood with good schools and quiet streets, and neighbours who waved hello when they saw her. The submarine was gone, donated to a maritime museum where it would be preserved as a testament to Adelaide Thornton's courage and the injustice she had tried to expose. The gold had been returned as much as possible to the descendants of those from whom it had been stolen. Patterson had died in the spring, peacefully in his sleep. In his will, he had left Elena the salvage yard, along with a note that said simply, "You reminded me that some things are worth fighting for. Thank you." She had sold the yard to a young couple who wanted to continue his work, keeping only a small piece of land near the water where she sometimes went to sit and think and remember. The truck was gone too, replaced by a reliable minivan that got her to work and back without complaint. Elena had taken a job at a community college, teaching adult education classes to women who were trying to rebuild their lives. The work was hard but meaningful, and every time she looked into the eyes of a student who had been told she was worthless, she saw herself a year ago, standing in the rain, wondering if she would ever find solid ground. The Thorntons had survived, as she had known they would. Money had a way of insulating people from the worst consequences of their actions. Harrison had stepped down from his company, but his children were still wealthy, still powerful, still moving through the world with the confidence of those who had always had more than they needed. Judge Margaret's nomination had been withdrawn, but she was still a judge, still handing down decisions that would shape people's lives. But something had changed. The story had spread, had been picked up by historians and filmmakers and activists who saw in Adelaide's crusade a symbol of something larger. A foundation had been established in her name, dedicated to recovering looted assets and returning them to their rightful owners. Ruth ran it, with Elena serving on the board, and every year they received hundreds of inquiries from families who had been searching for justice just as long as Ruth had. The Thornton name, once synonymous with wealth and prestige, now carried an asterisk. Every mention of the family's achievements was accompanied by a reminder of their crimes. Children would grow up learning about Warren Thornton, not as a shipping magnate, but as a war profiteer. The history books would tell the truth. That was Adelaide's legacy. That was what Eleanor had helped to build. Sofia appeared at the back door, her face flushed from running, Miguel trailing behind her, with grass stains on his knees. "Mama, can we have popsicles?" "After dinner," Elena said. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Sofia rolled her eyes in the particular way that 7-year-olds did when they believed themselves to be suffering unbearable injustice, and then ran back to her brother. Eleanor watched them chase each other through the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening air, and felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Peace, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of something solid beneath her feet. The knowledge that she had faced the worst the world could throw at her, and had not been broken. The certainty that whatever came next, she would meet it with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through the salvage yard, and the submarine, and the confrontation with people who had every advantage except the one that mattered. She had been told that she was powerless, that she was nothing, that her life and her children's lives were worth less than the secrets of wealthy people. And she had proven all of them wrong. Not with violence, not with wealth, not with the kind of power that the world usually recognized and rewarded, but with something simpler and more enduring, the refusal to surrender, the willingness to stand in the rain and hold on to hope even when hope seemed foolish. The faith that truth, buried for 60 years in a secret compartment, would eventually find its way into the light. Elena turned away from the window and began to prepare dinner. Outside, her children played in the golden evening light, safe and loved, and full of a future that no one could take from them. And somewhere, in a museum by the sea, a small submarine sat in honoured silence, a monument to the woman who had hidden the evidence of a crime, and the woman who had found the courage to reveal it, separated by 6 decades and connected by something stronger than time. Justice. That was Adelaide's word, the one she'd written over and over in her journals, the hope she'd clung to even as the darkness closed in. And now finally, that word had meaning. Not the hollow kind that powerful people used to justify their actions, but the real kind, the kind that changed things, that healed wounds, that made the world a little more honest than it had been before. Elena Vasquez had bought an abandoned submarine for $800. She had found a fortune in a secret compartment. But the true treasure was something that could never be counted or weighed. The knowledge that ordinary people, armed with nothing but the truth and the stubborn refusal to be silenced, could still bend the arc of the universe toward justice. And in the end, that was worth more than all the gold in the world. The last light of sunset faded over the small house with its neat yard and its sound of children laughing, and Elena stood at her kitchen window, watching the stars begin to appear. She thought of Adelaide, alone in her submarine, writing by candlelight, hoping against hope that someone would find her words and understand. "I found you," Elena whispered to the woman she had never met, the woman whose courage had changed everything. "I found you, and I kept my promise." She could not hear an answer, of course. There was no ghost in the kitchen, no supernatural presence to confirm that her words had been received. But Elena liked to think that somewhere, in whatever place the dead went when their work was finally done, Adelaide Thornton was at peace. The truth had been told. The stolen gold had been returned. The Thorntons had been held accountable. And Elena, poor exhausted cornered Elena, who had stood in the rain with $43 in her pocket and nowhere to sleep, had risen, not through violence, not through wealth, but through the most powerful force in the world, a mother's love, sharpened by desperation, tempered by sacrifice, and aimed at the heart of injustice. Some stories end with a sword, some end with a crown. But the best stories, the truest stories, end with a woman standing in her kitchen, watching her children play, knowing that she has given them something more valuable than any fortune could ever be. She has given them the truth. And the truth, unlike gold, can never be stolen.